And just a short introduction to Jack. Jack Halberstam is the leading writer in gender theory and queer studies, who has also published extensively on literature, film, and visual arts. Jack's publications record begins with Female Masculinity in 1998, which articulates alternative masculinities to the male body and its effects of power and legitimacy. Jack has also written the books The Drag King Book, Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, and In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives. Jack teaches at the University of Southern California and holds a professorship and directorship of the Center for Feminist Research. Jack has lectured on gender studies at Harvard University and the University of Basel, Switzerland, and has received the Compton Noel Award for Best LGBT Essay, the Publishers Triangle Judy Brown Award for Lesbian Nonfiction for Female Masculinity, a UCSD Humanities Center Fellowship, the Reflex Visiting Professor of Gay and Lesbian Studies position at Yale University, and is Draper Postdoctoral Fellow, Liberal Studies, New York University. Please join me in welcoming Jack Halberstam.
Gosh, thank you so much for being patient. Sorry about the technical difficulties. You remember the days when people just showed up, had a paper, read it? Apparently we don't do that anymore. And maybe that will be okay, because actually I have some really interesting clips and slides for you. So many thanks to the heroic efforts of all concerned to get this going. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to Mark for setting this up. I actually have a series of events in London that are all oriented around this theme of anarchy that I've been trying to think about and write about for a little while now. And what I'm going to do here today is something very schematic, actually, because I think some people in the audience have heard some pieces of this, so I will do some of the pieces. But I also want to present for you in the first half of my talk, some rationales for why we might want to think about anarchy right now, and in relationship to what kinds of political projects, because I don't think that that's an obvious question, and I think that particularly in Europe, people are quite suspicious of anarchist politics. It seems like something that has run its course, something that people associate either with the 1970s, with situationism or punk, or going back further, they associate anarchism with turn-of-the-century revolutionary movements that never came to fruition. And so I think that you're quite justified to be skeptical of anarchy. But notice how anarchy has come back around in the Occupy movement and in many of these global movements, from the Arab Spring to the uprisings in Greece, to the protests in Paris, to the various uprisings in Spain. People are so sick and tired of state politics that I ask you to just hold on to the idea of anarchy, not as a very clear tradition that we all know, but hold on to it as a name for something that is an alternative to business as usual that runs through the state. Okay, so in that paragraph that I circulated as a way of advertising the talk, I suggested that we would all do well to really delve into what James C. Scott was trying to get at in Seeing Like a State, where he suggests that we've all been trained to see and think like states, and that modernism actually imposes a particular aesthetic onto the world and onto maps, onto the urban, if you like, and onto societies, an aesthetic of symmetry, order, and harmony, as opposed to dissonance, chaos, and disorganization that may serve us better in this day and age when the state is clearly simply allied with big business. Okay, so that's the preamble here. And I'm, you know, every time I've given a talk on anarchy in England or in Europe, I get the same kinds of questions that I think are coming from a really old-fashioned leftist socialist project that still believes in a revolutionary white working class that's going to rise up or something, okay? We don't live in that world. We live in a world where we have to really think about affiliations and solidarities, and therefore you will see me try to map out a very different understanding of anarchy, some of which reaches back to punk, some of which reaches back to the 1920s, to Russian anarchism in particular, but some of which moves forward through what Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey call the undercommons, a rendering of anarchy that works through a reading of blackness. Okay, so that's my totally disorganized map of where we're going to go. And these are literally notes. And, you know, it's nice to have somebody come in and do a polished talk. This won't be that. This is notes. I'm trying to think along some different lines of inquiry with you and hoping for your feedback, as I am really very much at the beginning of this book. That said, I do think that you can find in the two books that I published recently, The Queer Art of Failure and Gaga Feminism, there's a kind of reaching for an anarchist politics in both of those. Cleaving to the logic of failure is a kind of disorganizing project. It wants to refuse the logic of success and offer up something in its place that isn't all that clear, but goes under the name of failure to the extent that capitalism understands success in terms of profit and heteronormativity. And in Gaga Feminism, I suggest that we're a little bit behind the changes that have already happened in our thinking. So Gaga Feminism basically makes the argument that in the realm of sex, gender, kinship, and the family, literally everything has changed, and we have failed to make sense of that change. We are behind that change. We are still talking about families as if families exist in all of their nuclear glory, and they do not. So given the kind of chaos that is already rendered at these kind of micro levels of sociality, again, it's not a matter of being for or against anarchy. We may in fact simply be living with it already and just need some intellectual tools in order to make sense of our moment that is much more ruled by disorganization than it is by order. So that's the preamble. Where are we going to go? Well, there are two pieces that I'm putting together here. The first gives you 6 arguments for anarchy. Why think about anarchy? And coming out of completely different contexts, some of which will not at all work together. And then in the second half, I'll just give you a piece of the archive that I'm gesturing towards, because part of this project is about naming an archive that is interested and invested in an anarchist way of being. And there are many things that go into that archive. It doesn't follow the sort of genre, time, place, ways in which we have historicized the aesthetic in the past. It isn't just modernist works by people of this color and gender. It's more what would happen if we had an archive made up of works that are oriented to disruption. That's my archive. Works that are oriented to disruption, high and low, popular and avant-garde, therefore all across the map, and not at all forming an archive in an orderly way that we might expect. So one of the big arguments that I'm making is on behalf of a different understanding of the archive that we need, and the archive that comes to us through this project of creating, fomenting, and encouraging disruption. Okay? And I'll give you little glimmers of that archive, and then you can maybe give me feedback on the archive or tell me other things that you think would go in such an archive. Okay? So that's kind of where we're going. So let's just start then with this question of why anarchy. So as I've said, people's faith in the state and in a politics of assimilation, and even more in a politics of identity, have worn thin. Right? So the social movements of the 1970s and the identity politics that they produced were effective for a while as a kind of anti-capitalist, anti-normative inscription. But they also have become formulaic in this day and age. And therefore, I think people are trying to think about new ways of being in solidarity with one another, new ways of thinking about communality, collectivity, affiliation, and so on. And race, class, gender, and sexuality, it seems to me, no longer name the ways in which people coalesce. Okay? So in that moment then, We have to turn to an anti-hegemonic, anti-state, anti-assimilationist position, many of which have been rendered thinkable by movements like the Occupy movement. And of course, Dave Graeber, who I believe is at Goldsmiths, has been one of the people who has really insisted that we turn our attention to anarchy, and in the process has become a kind of famous, celebrity anarchist, which sort of goes against the grain of anarchy, and it was not, I'm sure, what he intended. But people want to create new canons and new genealogies of the famous people in a new anarchist movement. That's not what this is about. This is actually, as he himself says, about developing what both he and I call low theory, a theory that is appropriate to a politics that needs to do something in the moment, as opposed to build a large, extensive, long-term abstract project. Low theory answers to the contingencies of the moment. There's also, of course, the anarchist collective that came out of Paris a few years ago that I've been really taken with, the Invisible Committee, who wrote The Coming Insurrection following the 2005 riots in the Banlieue around Paris, race riots for the most part. And they, in that little book, that collective suggested that both capitalism and the normative family have reached their logical end. Right? So it is possible that we actually are not living with capitalism anymore. It is possible. I know we don't know how to explain, name, or describe the version of the economy that we live with, and so we stick with capitalism, but it is possible that we're in a much more monopolistic system that has none of the potential for distribution that capitalism actually had. We may be in a much more authoritarian, is what Zizek would say, an authoritarian version of capitalism that deserves some other name in order to name its logic, right? We are also, this is a good time for, oh yeah, I have some slides, that's just a fun, sort of where are we going, and I think that this is what I mean by low theory. There's low theory on the walls and, spray painted on sidewalks and streets. And okay, burn the rich may not seem like a super complex theoretical concept, but we probably could make a big theoretical deal around the idea of burning the rich. So there's theory all around us in people's deep dissatisfaction, okay? I think of a project, all of these participatory art projects that really have come into their own right now. Someone like Gillian Waring, I think it was back in the 80s, her project where she went around and asked people to write on signs and hold them up, and there was that incredible image of the policeman holding up a sign saying, help me, and the businessman holding up a sign saying, I'm desperate, right? This is the moment that we're at, where we have to read this inscription of our moment into the ephemeral, onto the walls and all of the graffiti that's all around us. This too is theory. This too is speech. This too is discourse. It's a good moment to also go back to formations that now seem anachronistic, like the Greenham Common Women, about whom sociologist Sasha Roseniel wrote. That seems like a thing of the past, but was actually a pretty elaborate anarchist structure, feminist anarchist structure that blockaded a US military development for a very long time. For all I know, they're still there. Are they? And there are all kinds of problems with it, but it's a moment to go back and think about some of these anarchist organizations that anyway have arisen within the last 2 decades or so. It's also a moment where you can find lots and lots of different people who you wouldn't actually read together, all turning to anarchy. Okay, Simon Critchley is a good example. Faith for the Faithless is an anti-Zizekian call for anarchy. Lauren Ballant, at the end of Cruel Optimism, weirdly, you don't think that that's where she's going, but suddenly at the end of Cruel Optimism, she says, I think this is what people like Dave Graeber, the Occupy movement, and the anarchists are talking about, and makes a little pitch for anarchism at the end of that book. James C. Scott, who everyone suspected of being an anarchist and seeing like a state, comes out with a book, 2 Cheers for Anarchism. So don't just suspect he's an anarchist, he is an anarchist. And out he comes with a little book arguing for ways of basically inhabiting anarchism in the everyday, everyday ways in which people can break with the rules that govern sense-making projects. Okay, Franco Barani, an Italian anarchist writer who's written a cool little book called Poetry and Finance. These books are all over the place and deserve to be read together, not as strange little outlying theoretical books, but as a new way of thinking about a moment whose logic in many ways eludes us. There's also a fantastic book that I recommend by Shelley Strebe called Radical Sensations, in which she reads three currents of anarchy alongside of each other. One is a Latin American version of anarchy that runs through LA onto the Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century through the Magón Flores brothers. The second strand is a black anarchy that runs through the world workers movement, and particularly black anarchist Ben Fletcher. And another is a native form of anarchy that she reads through the work of Lucy Parsons. And I'll come back to Lucy Parsons, who was a mixed-race anarchist speaker from the 1920s. I'll come back to her in the second half of my talk. So why anarchy? My only answer can be, why not? Okay? Socialism does not seem like the way to go. It still engages in state politics. Anarchy is a principle that in many ways is already being enacted in a lot of different places, in a lot of different collaborative economies that people are actually already engaged in. It's not something you have to call for, it's something you have to notice as it actually develops around you. So that's point number one. Number two, is anarchy just libertarianism by another name? That's a really reasonable question to ask. And particularly in the US, where people want to say that anarchist movements are basically versions of the Tea Party, anti-big government, libertarians who just want the government out of their life and in return want to retreat into the realm of the private. That is an absolutely reasonable question. But I think that we can have lots of different versions of anti-state politics, right? One, anti-state politics doesn't only register as a retreat into the private. It could also mean enhancing a different version of collectivity and the public. And here I would direct you to a brilliant take on the anarchist politics of Thoreau by Xavier Nyong'o, who reminds us that, and here's the quote he was working with by Thoreau. You remember from Civil Disobedience in 1849, Thoreau said, "I heartily accept the motto that government is best which governs least, and I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe, that government is best which governs not at all," which could feed right into the Tea Party for sure. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. Government is at best but an expedient, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. Now the reason that Thoreau was saying this was he was making an opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. That's the important piece of this. That this was not just a, I want the government out of my life, I want to determine my own destiny, make my own choices. He was making a principled stand against a government that made it legal to pursue fugitive slaves. So when your government stands for the re-enslavement or stands for slavery per se, you would do well to be against government. That's the point about Thoreau that Xavier Nyong'o makes very clear in a short essay about Thoreau. So contrary to popular belief, critique of the state is not de facto a defense of individual liberty from government interference. It can be, as we see in another book by James C. Scott, The Art of Being Ungoverned, a history of maroon and fugitive communities that have sought refuge in the past as in the present from what Children Anarchy calls the violence of inclusion. Now when Children Anarchy talks about the violence of inclusion, he's really talking about neoliberalism and the way in which the state pulls you into its discourse and its logics by recognizing you, right? So people who think that they are basically making history by arguing for gay marriage are in fact simply arguing to be part of a state logic of relationships, A state logic, by the way, that then runs roughshod over all kinds of other anarchist intimacies, sporadic intimacies, occasional intimacies, ephemeral intimacies that do not require the recognition of the state. So when our choice is either gay marriage or no gay marriage, we are being ruled by the violence of inclusion. To be included is a kind of violence that may be more violent than being excluded. And I think that's a point that Fred and Stefano make in the comments. They do not seek to be included in a system that has understood itself through their exclusion. Do you see what I mean? To the extent that the state understands itself as righteous by governing through principles that are basically institutionalized racism, why seek to be included? Inclusion is a form of violence. James C. Scott, in The Art of Being Ungoverned, gives this history of all these communities that formed in the 17th and 18th century around state-run communities. And his point is, our histories of nation only tell the story of the nation-state. But for every nation-state in the 18th century, there was a maroon or fugitive community made up of people who were being recruited to do the labor of the state and who had to flee. There's the same argument made in Linebaugh and Redeker. As long as we have had capitalism, we have had resistance to capitalism. And it would behoove us to tell those histories, the history of the resistance to capitalism and the history of these maroon or fugitive communities. And there's just one of these 19th century paintings of the Dismal Swamp that were renderings of the terrible things that would happen to you if you tried to flee slavery. But in fact, maroon communities were places of reinvention, rethinking of what it meant to be a community, and very, very vital critiques of the state. So let's not confuse anarchy, therefore, with libertarianism. Let's also recognize these long histories of exclusion and non-state community building. Anarchist politics, then, is a clustering of all kinds of social justice positions, few of which would ever reduce down to individualism, and therefore I just ask that you hold anarchy right now as a space for the critique of governmental forms that developed in the 19th century, as Foucault has reminded us, as new techniques of rule, and that have now, as so many other 19th century forms have expired, right? It's the same thing in the university, and I don't have to tell you this at Goldsmiths, because Goldsmiths has a curriculum that's been reinvented. But all over this country and all over the US, there are 19th century forms of knowing that still do their work as disciplines, that presume that the world is the same now as it was at the end of the 19th century. It could be that state government is a 19th century form that has outlived its usefulness and therefore is absolutely available for corruption, as we've seen in the last 10 years, and that this is the moment to reimagine governance and rule itself. And I think if you really follow Foucault's argumentation in Discipline and Punish, I don't think you simply arrive at governmentality. You actually also arrive at the question of what is the alternative to the state, okay? It can't be just like one form of domination always feeds into another. One form of domination creates and spurs multiple forms of resistance, and those counter-hegemonic histories are really, really crucial for us to trace right now. 3, why the wild? So, you know, and I hear the questions about the wild, and the wild is a really tricky term, having passed through modernism and through primitivism as a term for the barbaric peoples who lie outside of so-called European civilization, but also as a name for something like untamed nature, right? The wild seems like a completely colonized term and part of the language of coloniality itself. So I think that the argument is, can you take back the wild from its colonial context? And a number of different people, again, are trying to do this as we speak. In the 19th century, the wild took something like nature, as its referent. Nature is a term that we no longer will even recognize as naming anything that lay outside of a cultural production of the meaning of nature. By the late 19th and 20th century, the wild had become part of a colonial division of the world into the modern and the primitive. Now, just because that is so, it seems to me that there's a lot lost if you then just give up on this term, because it has a lot of resonance as a term. It has a kind of critical productivity that I would want to work with. I mean, if just thinking about wildness, and that is actually the name of a punk queer film that came out last year from Wu Sang, a LA-based artist who ran a club every Tuesday night called Wildness. That was a weird configuration of queer, people of color, and drag queens from Central America in some kind of strange coalition that, by the way, didn't lead to a utopia, but led to the colonizing of the space such that the Latin American drag queens were being pushed out. The film is a really interesting rendering of that struggle between queers who want to produce alternative space and the colonial power of taking over space that often renders other people as outsiders. So wildness is a term that people are already using to think with. Maybe it's a term we should be using instead of queerness. Queerness has lost some of its critical edge, it's lost some of its pliability. And yes, we would have to use it sullied as it is by its colonial context. We can't shake free of this colonial division between the modern and the primitive, but we can think about what wildness might signify in a post-colonial world within an anti-colonial project. Okay? Now you may tell me that we can't go there and we can't do this, and that's fine, but let's take the risk, because anarchy does hint at something like wildness, right? And this is often the argument against it. Well, if we take on anarchy, what would that look like? Oh my gosh, what would that be? There's a fantasy of some wild eruption, Fight Club style, of, alpha male, chaotic, violent struggle, competition of wills and so on. Okay, maybe. But again, the wild, it seems to me, has a lot of potential, and I'm going to make the argument for kind of claiming it. The wild as a concept has been important to a lot of different anarchist thinkers, as it turns out. Do I even have a... Oh, well, there you go, that will work. And I'll get to that reference in a minute. Henry Thoreau, of course, wrote a lot about the wild, and he did kind of mean nature, but he did also mean that space outside of government rule. The Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, whose work has really come back around in the context of Occupy, thought a lot about wild forms of economy. And he referred to this notion of mutual aid, which I'm sure many people here know about. He suggested that while capitalism presumes competition as a mode of life, right, and presumes that wherever you see animals, you're seeing the struggle for life rendered through competition, through competitive relations where only the strong survive, right? He says that's a really weird reading of nature, because actually most animal species survive not simply through competition, but through immensely complicated social forms of cooperation. So if we wanted to borrow from other species with whom we share the planet, we wanted to borrow social systems, we can do a lot better than competition. We could look at some of these very elaborate forms of social cooperation practiced by birds, by lizards, by ants, by bees, and see different ways in which divisions of labor are created, divisions of resources are created, the way that bats actually engage in what they call altruistic feeding. Bat colonies are very, very vulnerable to environmental toxins, and bats only have one baby at a time, right? So in order for a bat colony to survive, everyone needs to feed. So if one bat goes out and gets food, every bat has to share from that food. Never one bat eats, only all bats eat, okay? How about that as a system for human society? If some people are eating, everyone should be eating. In a world of surplus, everyone should be eating, okay? So Kropotkin's point was, look around. We live among fabulous social structures. And those fabulous social structures, non-human mostly, have figured things out that we have not figured out and that we could easily learn from. We can also think about, I don't know why I put that up now. Yes, I do. Just to say, and I'm actually going to be talking about this, where the wild things are, much more over at Bookback tomorrow in relationship to the question of children and anarchy, and I'll just hint at that in a moment. But just to say that this beautiful children's story is asking some of the same questions about whether there's a space where the wild things are that we can find, that we can go to, and to get there we somehow have to go through the child. Now I want to, there's the mutual aid of Peter Kropotkin, but I want to just make a segue here through a modernist poem written by Wallace Stevens, very much around this time when there were lots and lots of anarchist theories flying around, including Kropotkin's. And there's a beautiful rendering in here of what is meant by the wild that retains its colonial value but hints at something else. And let's just read it. So he says, anecdote of the dry. And I love that it's anecdote. It's a little bit like notes. It's not a narrative. It's not a discourse. It's not a full-fledged theory. It's an anecdote. Anecdote of the jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. It's a super simple image that a jar is placed on a hill. But I think what he's trying to capture is exactly the act of enclosure. What happens when someone says, this space is mine, right? That's the act of enclosure. You contain a space, you give it boundaries, give it borders, and enclose it from the outside. And in doing so, you produce wildness or wilderness. Suddenly the wilderness, the slovenly wilderness that is without shape or form, now surrounds that hill. This space that was unmarked becomes marked by not being within the jar. So it's actually a very beautiful spatial rendering of the wild, both as that thing that is produced by a colonial act of enclosure, but also something that sprawls around, no longer wild, right? And the jar takes dominion, the jar was grey and bare, did not give of bird and bush, suggesting that the wild still contains within it forms of life that the jar itself has snuffed out, okay? So that's a kind of poetics of the wild and of the wilderness, of this process within which the colonial defines the wild, but the wild exceeds the colonial definition, okay? I guess that's the point that I would like you to hold on to. The wild is also a name for ungovernability. And this is a very recent sign, whoever they vote for, we are ungovernable. This is the notion of being ungovernable has been a big part of the riots around the world, in Egypt, as well as in Spain, as well as in Greece. The idea that to the extent that the government wants to control the circulation of wealth and hold onto it for a very small percentage of the population, we therefore must be ungovernable. Now, the idea of ungovernability, of course, does not originate with these Occupy movements in urban centers. And in fact, it makes more sense to look at indigenous struggles for land in order to think about ungovernability. And this scholar, NYU, Dean Saranio, documents the alternative modes of economy and social organization cultivated by indigenous people. He cites Jeff Corntassel, who's also an indigenous anarchist scholar, Jeff Corntassel's argument for remaining ungovernable. Corntassel, in a little piece in a journal, describes how in the 1990s, due to all kinds of breakdowns in the economy and the government in Ecuador, and lots of different quarrels over land rights, the indigenous peoples of Ecuador were deemed ungovernable. They were named ungovernable in order to bring in a kind of police state. Now, Corntassel argues that indigenous people should always be ungovernable, that this should be the project of indigeneity to remain ungovernable. Because to be governed would be to surrender to a form of sovereignty that came in the form of genocide originally. So he makes the argument for being ungovernable in the context of indigenous land struggles, and Dean Saranio suggests that that we have as many forms of ungovernability and as many forms of alternative economy as we have indigenous groups around the world. And there are, in excess of 500 indigenous groups in Latin America alone. Therefore, here are 500 different forms of living outside of the state according to different political inscriptions and economies. Corntassel says, quote, "This form of ungovernability is what indigenous peoples should be striving to achieve." So ungovernability becomes a goal rather than being received as a kind of an insult or a critique. By participating in state-authored forms of governance, Corntassel argues that indigenous people are forced to collude with ideologies and systems that are built upon and ultimately demand their eradication. De-occupation, this is important because the Occupy movement has used this term that is kind of offensive, in fact, to indigenous peoples for whom occupation has been their reality for the last 300 years. And by the way, Occupy Wall Street, there's a way in which it doesn't realize the history of Wall Street. Wall Street was the street that was built up to keep the Native Americans out and the settlers in the area that was being called Manhattan. So we really should be talking about de-occupation strategies that seek to uproot not only settler colonial laws, but settler values around issues like work and the use of natural resources and land. And there are lots of different versions of this. I won't go through them all, but I would refer you to a book by Jody Bird called Transit of Empire, in which she writes about what she calls the cacophonies of colonialism, and suggests that indigenous people respond to the orderly harmony of colonialism with a cacophonous counter discourse. So there you have that kind of anarchist notion of disorder again. For Jody Bird, colonialism is a violent clash of cultures, systems, and peoples that, quote, creates shockwaves that ripple outward from collision in time, space, and popular culture. In her book, she notes that the Indian inevitably appears in colonial productions as dead, past, inert, savage, and wild, and uses this metaphor of cacophony as a metaphor for the anarchy that she believes indigenous groups should be harnessing in response to the colonial order. Okay, 4 of 6. Okay, so you can see we're moving towards the end here. What are the sexual politics of anarchy? And that's really, in a way, what my book is moving towards. So I don't really exactly have an answer yet, except to say that in my book, God, Feminism, I was trying to outline a way in which sexual politics now should seek to intensify the confusion and the chaos around the family rather than to resolve it. But there are lots of anarchist thinkers who have made reference to sex and gender in the rethinking of human society that they believe anarchism participates in. So Emma Goldman is the most obvious, so we'll just go to her. Goldman, famously was against marriage itself. Many anarchists understand marriage to be a property relation, as of course it was. For most of the 19th century, marriage was a way for men to control female reproduction and ensure that their offspring would inherit their wealth, right? So how marriage became the banner for liberation is absolutely beyond me. It's actually the inscription of property rights and inheritance. It is not a gateway to liberation. It's the gateway to, as Reddy put it, the violence of inclusion. Goldman was absolutely vicious about marriage, as you'll see in this passage. She says, marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact. It differs from the ordinary life insurance agreement only in that it's more binding, more exacting. Okay? Imagine thinking about marriage like that. Take all the romance, all the bells and whistles off. It's an insurance contract. Is it so fun now, right? Do you need more insurance in your life? Its returns are insignificantly small compared with its investments. Think what you put in, think what you get out. In taking out an insurance policy, one pays for it in dollars and cents, always at liberty to discontinue payments. If, however, woman's premium is a husband, she pays for it with her name, her privacy, her self-respect, her very life, until death doth part, right? Those words are so chilling. Till death us do part. My God, is it a lifelong relationship or a prison sentence, right? Moreover, the marriage insurance condemns her to lifelong dependency, to parasitism, to complete uselessness. She doesn't mince words on this, clearly. Individual as well as social. Man too pays his toll, but as his sphere is wider, marriage does not limit him as much as woman. He feels his chains more in an economic sense. Thus Dante's motto over Inferno applies with equal force to marriage. Ye who enter here, leave all hope behind. But how do you really feel about marriage, Emma? All right. So the point being, and many anarchists from the turn of the last century and the middle of the 20th century had very elaborate intimate relations. The Magón Flores brothers, who were the architects of the Mexican Revolution, were not married to their partners and had multiple relationships, as did their female partners. So this is an understanding that actually these kinds of relationships that require contracts are an extension of capitalism. They are the rendering of human relations as more economic inscriptions, right? And it's quite interesting, actually, to look at some of the writings, not simply by the socialists, but by the anarchists from a number of different sides about this critique of marriage. Now, did they then think, therefore, that homosexuality was great? Well, maybe not exactly, but I think that there was a kind of open quality to whatever kinds of desires people were going to express. Socialism at this time, we know, it was much more normatively oriented, really looked for an investment in the family to the extent that the family was to feed again back into the state. So I think that there's lots of work to be done here anyway on the politics of, sexual politics of anarchy. And I want to give you this image to just bring together these last 2 points about colonialism as an inscription of order upon peoples who must remain ungovernable, and then the idea that sexuality itself should remain in the register of the ungovernable and disorderly. And this is a queer native artist, Kent Monkman. Take a minute to register what this is. And he takes he takes the exact style of 19th century renderings of Native Americans as this, romantic feature of the landscape where usually you have cowboys chasing Indians across an empty western landscape. He turns it into first a homoerotic relation. This one's called the artist and the model. But second, a decolonizing gaze, where it is the Native American in caricatured form who not only is painting the other, but in the process is killing him. In other words, reminding us that representation is a form of rule and is a form of violence, and has been one way in which settler colonialism has done its work. Okay, so you know we're at number 4, so we have 2 more points to go, and then we'll see what time it is, and maybe I'll stop there. Are children anarchists? So for more on this question, I am going to actually speak on this topic tomorrow at Birkbeck, but simply put, yes. I'm quite interested in the category of the wild child. I think Sarah Ahmed maybe has written a little bit about this too in terms of willfulness. But the idea that people are like, well, my gosh, anarchy, what is that? Well, as a way of being in the world, we all pass through a certain kind of anarchist way of being. That's exactly Freud's point in terms of the very regimented and orderly inscription of the subject that has to take place in order to deliver this disorderly child to reproductive, normative adulthood, right? So anyone who's ever chased around a 2-year-old, will not have a hard time thinking about what anarchy actually looks like. If kids were not anarchistic, then we would not need to train them. Do you see what I mean? If kids were not wild first, then there would be no need for us to instill within them our values. If it was natural to be the way that we are, and I'm not putting any particular value into the natural, other than to say we have very particular ways that we believe children must be socialized into. And for any child in that sort of pre-Oedipal phase, those social standards are incredibly difficult to cleave to, and therefore we can think about wildness in relationship to the child. Catherine von Stockton, of course, has also made this point in terms of thinking about children as potentially, rather than growing up, how can one foster a child who instead grows sideways? And that actually weirdly resonates with Jodie Bird's rendering of the colonial and the decolonial, where she says coloniality is vertical, and these cacophonies, indigenous cacophonies, are horizontal. So anarchism is interested in the horizontal relations, horizontality, the sideways, the adjacent, as opposed to the verticality of power that always presumes a hierarchy, a high and a low. Okay? And childhood is a set of relations that are horizontal within the peer group, but situated in relationship to very clear forms of verticality that come to us through the authoritarianism of parenthood. Okay, what is an anarchist aesthetic? And this is my last point. And I will play as much or as little of my archive as you're interested in. And this is where really, I'm ending really where I began, which is by saying that we need a history of an anarchist aesthetics that is less interested in genre, time and place, and more interested in grouping together works that perform the work of disruption. And there have been many, you know, I don't know what I have up here first. Well, take for example, Stravinsky and Nijinsky Diaghilev's Rite of Spring, of which this is actually the centenary, a really wild ballet, very interested in the savage, the wild, the primitive, and so on, but also interested in cacophonously responding to this modernist rendering of the primitive. And here's just one of the images from the original ballet. That is it's a absolutely crazy ballet. I saw a version of it recently in Berlin where there was a centenary event going on. It's literally a dance that you could die performing, which is pretty wild already, because the lead that has to be sacrificed, the chosen one, the girl who is picked out to be sacrificed, has to jump up and down so many times over the course of the ballet that she almost literally falls to the floor with exhaustion. At the end, it was an undanceable ballet. It created a riot, and in Germany, when I was presenting on the queerness of this, which wasn't exactly what they thought I was going to present on, so that was fun. There was a way, how is it not queer? Okay, first of all, Diaghilev, Stravinsky, and Nijinsky were all sleeping with each other, and they were all part of a queer group of artists in Paris who weirdly called themselves the Apaches. Okay, so, and then there's no place in the ballet where men and women actually dance with each other. So supposedly it's a fertility rite, but it's a fertility rite within which the men and the women are completely and utterly dancing in different registers and different circles. Now, at the event I was at in Berlin, they showed a German rendering of the rite by the fascist choreographer Mary Wigman, which nobody seemed to want to talk about the fact that she had choreographed the 1936 Olympics. Hello. And she had recreated the Rite of Spring as these little circles of men and women dancing together in a very orderly way. So it's a queer ballet, and it was met with a riotous and uproarious response that people were forgetting was a bourgeois riot of sensibility. You know, the bourgeoisie was like, no, this is hideous. It's about ugliness, the pintos, the quaking and shaking. It is not a pretty ballet. It is a violent, wild piece that created a wild response. So that would be one benchmark in our anarchist archive. You can throw Johnny Rotten in there, why can't you? I began my talk in Berlin by playing Anarchy in the UK to say this would be the lineage for Rite of Spring, would be moving up to punk rather than simply rendering it alongside Schoenberg or classical music. Why couldn't you? But you could also think of the screaming performances of Abby Lincoln. I don't know if people know Abby Lincoln. She was a blues singer who performed with Max Roach and performed a civil rights song that so-called degenerated into wild screaming that people found deeply offensive, but that of course captures the outrage within the civil rights movement. These are anarchist performances that break with the form, improvise, perform ugliness within a deeply negative and disruptive aesthetic on behalf of breaking with form, right? In order to create a different kind of history and a different kind of aesthetic. So I'm going to conclude. I did have other stuff in my archive, but I think I've probably spoken long enough, so I will just give you my concluding paragraph. Like the stories and emergence gestures preserved within kinesthetic memories in Joseph Roach's Cities of the Dead, or the performances of freedom that is staged because they cannot be inhabited by former slaves in Daphne Brooks' dissident bodies, or like the stories the archive will not and cannot tell in Saidiya Hartman's new work on Wayward Lives, my book on the Wild imagines a counter-history of queer anarchy as a crazy mosaic made up of moments, riots, and refusals, a stunted statement of revolt, an awkward ballet of restraint and release, an unheard scream in the night, a theory that sounds like madness, a love letter delivered to the world but never received, trash paintings, nightclubs that rise and fall, pop songs heard by all, understood by none, groups that seek to be ungovernable, anti-colonial, unbecoming. Anarchy certainly resonates through the rebel yell of a Johnny Rotten, as we hear in Grail Marcus's book, but it also echoes within the wild screams of protest as performed by Abby Lincoln, or the yelps of refusal summoned by a polystyrene. The anarchist performances that make up this archive articulate gendered and racialized outrage while dreaming of a place in time where there are no gods, no masters, and no church in the wild. I just want to also dedicate this talk to my friend Jose Munoz, who passed this weekend, and who was also writing about the wild. So, just wanted to say that. I'm happy to take questions or comments or guide me, direct me, push me somewhere. Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's just, you know, the huge question, right? That on the one hand, one wants to say, oh, fuck the state, there are all these other things going on, let's engage them. But that's exactly right, that very vulnerable subjects, the very subjects that one is, you know, sort of speaking to, speaking of, speaking with, require state protection in all kinds of ways. So, I guess the only way I can get at that question is to say, first of all, that lots and lots of people do engage in all kinds of activities that still don't run through the state. Lots of people are engaged in kinship structures that have nothing to do with the state, that don't entail formal adoption, that aren't registered, and yet that work, right? Many people participate in collaborative and alternative economies every single day, as Gibbs and Graham remind us in The End of Capitalism as We Knew It. We all, every time that we share something with a neighbor, every time we trade, there are so many different ways in which we already do this. So I'm not saying one can simply break with the state. No one does. It's impossible. This is now this is a hegemon, right? But I think I'm just saying, could we notice these small places where people don't just simply stand up and dissent, but literally opt out and do things differently. So it's a project that seeks to describe rather than call for. And I think Dean Serenio's work, he's an assistant professor at NYU, and he has literally example after example after example of indigenous groups who manage communities and economies separate from the state, particularly in Hawaii, for example. So it is ongoing, even though I think that question remains absolutely central to what comes next. I know that's inadequate, but you're nodding, so I'll take that. Yes?
I wanted to ask a bit, you talk about dismantling the state, and I'm kind of reminded of the teacher strike in Oaxaca in Mexico. What was it, 5, maybe longer, 7 years ago? Yeah. Where the city center, there's the Oaxaca commune that lasted, longer than the Paris commune, and it was this anarchistic society. But at the same time, women were still expected to do, the cooking and the cleaning, and so what is the point of doing away with the state when you have, remnants of the state like patriarchy or racism or other forms of...
Totally. I mean, that's why I'm saying this can't just be oh yeah, anarchy, let's have a new grand narrative. This has to be a partial narrative made up of pieces of queer critique and pieces of queer color critique. It's not a grand narrative notice. I mean, it's hard for me to answer that question, for example, precisely because it is about these pieces, fragments of dissent that have to work together. It isn't enough to just have a group of masculine subjects register their dissent, exactly right. Not when there is a huge amount of invisible domestic labor that props up that protest. But there are also many places in Mexico where people literally understand the state as being completely the same as the narco traffickers, right? And there's I forget the name of the little state in Mexico that has literally cut itself off from the government precisely because the government was using that state to run drugs through. So they have secured their boundary against the state to the extent that they do not want to participate in a state that is completely and utterly the same as the drug traffickers they are supposed to oppose. So Mexico is an interesting case in point. There's a lot of lawlessness on the one hand because of the drug trafficking, and there also are a lot of alternatives. There also are a lot of these indigenous communities that believe that they anyway have set themselves up separate from the state. But I think that this piece on the sexual economy or the sexual politics of anarchy is crucial. And notice I didn't have much other than Emma Goldman. So I'm really trying to think this through separate from just a critique of marriage. How can we make sure that an inscription of a different order of the sexual and the gender becomes absolutely a part of whatever new version of the commons we're interested in? But I am sort of encouraged by people like the Invisible Committee and the Coming Insurrection, because it wasn't just oh yeah, we need to take to the streets. It was the family is completely over as a 19th century concept. It's expired, as are these 19th century versions of the economy. Did you want to respond?
Well, yeah, when you're talking about that, it reminded me of when they wrote their introduction to Civil War. Yeah. And maybe I was going to ask you what the value of Civil War might be.
Let me ask you, what's the value of Civil War?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in terms of
yeah. Do you mean, are you specifically asking about violence?
No,
Or?
I don't mean like armed struggle, but
Right.
just like war and chaos.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually think that's what people are trying to create. You know, the Invisible Committee says, you know, the economy is in crisis, increase the crisis. And of course, we know also that the economy is always in crisis, so that we have to be the recipients, the people who take the fall for that crisis. But I do think that the more chaos, the more dissonance, the more likely it is that we could push through to some other order. I think the thing that's difficult about a project like this is that it must not prescribe what comes next. You know, I kind of learned this from people like Saidiya Hartman, who, even though her work often reaches for these alternatives through deep readings of the archive of slavery and resistance to slavery, she always refuses to say what comes next, because what comes next will be determined by changes that are made within the present. Do you see what I mean? We can't know what an alternative would look like because we are so steeped in this logic. So we can only create conditions for things to change enough that another future would be available. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. We hardly get speakers who are actually passionate about the subject. Sorry, that's true. I was wondering about the aesthetics that you were mentioning, especially because you said about Stravinsky and the Derive history. Because Goldsmiths was schizophrenic, and I don't think that he was necessarily making a piece that is reflecting any anarchy. And then that piece became a form of aesthetic after anyway, both the music and the ballet. So I can't really make a relation to punk after that.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the fact that Nijinsky was schizophrenic seems fine to me. I mean, you know, we can go back to Deleuze and Guattari and say that would be the right response to this version of, you know, capitalist realism, however you want to put it. But I don't need there to be an intention. Like, I don't need there to be an author of the anarchy. So I don't need to say, oh, Nijinsky really wanted to create something anarchistic, or Diaghilev. I mean, of course they wouldn't. These are bourgeois men sitting around, you know, making art without a bigger goal necessarily. But so I'm trying to read an archive within which you have performance or moments or events where something changes. So, like, whether or not it then becomes, you know, and it does become part of the canon of modernism, in its moment, people literally couldn't hear it as anything but noise. That was kind of what happened with all kinds of different versions of punk. It's kind of what happened in some of these vocalizations that Nina Simone and Abby Lincoln perform. That what people are hearing sounds like noise or nonsense in that kind of Jacques Attali sense, right? Like a what?
Ugliness?
Ugliness, yes.
And I think that ugliness is just a new aesthetic that it gets time to get used to it and appreciate it.
Okay, or you could say that it's a counter-aesthetic that refuses. Remember at the beginning I was saying James C. Scott says that modernism inscribes itself in us as a way that acclimatizes us to see like states, such that we want to hear harmony, we want to see order, we want to understand things rationally, and so on. So, yes, but maybe ugliness has some purpose that isn't just about wait till the blurring stops and then you'll see it's really beautiful. Let's actually hold on to the ugliness. There's something about ugliness that is great, and if you see the Rites of Spring performed now, it is ugly, it is weird, it is twisted, it isn't the kind of investment in the moves that ballet has classically glorified. So I'm not pulling it completely out of the blue, but notice how when you move away from genre, place, time, suddenly when things are put in juxtaposition, people are like, I just don't get that. I don't get why this would be placed alongside that. I understand that, but I think that one has to read things against each other that seemingly have nothing to do with each other in order to find these, what Grail Marcus calls secret histories. The secret histories that are unavailable to us because of the way in which we've narrated aesthetic culture.
Yes. I had ended asking a kind of labyrinthine question about Foucault and governmentality and how anarchy might function in relation to the state now, when it's almost like a shimmer, a Wizard of Oz sort of symbol in a way. But your use of the Wallace Stevens poem actually was quite, I felt quite moved by that, because it made me think about the relationship between wilderness and the fugitive in American literature. Yeah. And I wonder if you know the film The Fugitive Kind by Sidney Lumet from 1959, because it's an extraordinary film about wildness and the fugitive. And I actually just want to quote a line from it to you, if I can, because it does fit in with this idea of wilderness. It's a film which does deal with transgressive sexuality. Marlon Brando is trying to transgress his sexuality, Anna Magnani and Joanne Woodward as well. And it's very definitely a critique of marriage, definitely. But Tennessee Williams wrote the script, and there's a wonderful quote that Marlon Brando gives in it, where he says, "Wild things leave skins behind, tokens to pass from one to the other, so that the fugitive kind can follow their kind." And I really like this idea of fugitive and wilderness coming together in that way. And the fact that you mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act as well, I think is almost a kind of poetic twist on this, in a way. How does one reclaim the fugitive and wilderness in a way that fits in with this line in American literature, but also how to reclaim it politically in some way.
Thank you so much. What's your name?
Catherine.
Catherine. Maybe we can talk afterwards. That was amazing. You know, a lot of, I think the way in which I'm thinking about fugitivity, and this is absolutely perfect, is in line with, again, with Fred Moten's work. Certainly the work he does with Stefano Hani in the Undercommons, but also in The Break, where Fred is really the theorist of fugitivity, because it's fugitivity for him as opposed to liberation, because liberation is always dialectically defined in relationship to unfreedom, and therefore he kind of makes a theoretical pitch for something like fugitivity as a way of being that is in the break between freedom and enslavement, right? Saidiya Hartman says the same thing in Scenes of Subjection, that if one group of white settler colonials have been the authors of slavery, they cannot then be the authors of freedom as well. You cannot be freed by the people who enslaved you. You cannot be freed by the people who enslaved you. Therefore, the concept of freedom will have to be remade, separate from that episteme. So I think that that's what people are after with fugitivity, is refusing the politics of liberation as they have been formed within an Enlightenment context. But I'm definitely going to look at this film. That sounds really perfect. Thank you.
I'll give you a copy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. I really enjoyed the talk, thank you. But then I got to the bit about punk, and you mentioned the Sex Pistols, and I was just like, oh, really?
Oh, I know. I know. Forgive me, I am a child of the 70s, all right.
Like, I think there are so many other...
Of course there are. And just as there are so many other rites of spring too, which goes to the other question, it's a gesture to say, look, you could put in conversation the riots provoked by Rite of Spring, the riots provoked by Johnny Rotten, and the riots that answered to or were conjured by Abbie Lincoln. We could make a history of these aesthetic moments of riot. That's all I meant by it. There's no, like, let's prefer Johnny Rotten to anyone else. In fact, I have a whole punk chapter in this book that is all about queer punk that has nothing to do with the Sex Pistols. So apologies. Thanks for calling me out. I'll take it. Any other? Oh, yes.
Thank you for a really interesting talk, and I love how you see potential in failed forms of being. I get so much from that. But I think my question goes back to the first one. I kept thinking as you were speaking about it's not an increasing anti-feminism, it's an increasingly unmasked anti-feminism in the left in this country that has become actually very disturbing for many of us. And one of the things that I've noticed is the often anarchism, even if it's not like the dominant political discourse, has often become a kind of ego ideal amongst certain stances of the left, so they're almost like as if to say norms, conventions and rules are what gets imposed by either the state or state-allied organisations, and what restricts our freedom. And part of that phenomena is the identification of feminism itself as the state. Is what is imposing norms and rules, what is getting in the way of our freedom. So here, anarchism becomes the self-identity as freedom from norms, which becomes the self-identity as freedom to exploit others. And I'm really concerned about how you would think through that phenomena whilst also maintaining your sense of the potentiality in the anarchist movement.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. First of all, an increasing anti-feminism in the left in this country, really, or has it just always been anti-feminist?
It's much more visible.
People are coming out and being anti-feminist proudly, as opposed to trying to pretend that they're feminist, but it's concealed under a discourse of...
Okay.
That's what.
Having grown up in England, I always have this, my image of the UK is always as this like place that feminism never really happened, okay? And I know that's, I'm not saying it didn't, I'm just saying that English masculinity is just particularly resilient as a form. And therefore, that's why I'm pushing towards an anarchism that comes out of queer theory, queer of color critique, and feminist theory, not going back to Bakunin, Proudhon. You know, that people are like, oh yes, but what about Bakunin? What about Proudhon? What about the canon of anarchist thinking? Who cares? That's not what we're after. What we're after is a longer tradition of social movements within which norms have been contested. Those intellectual traditions are queer and are feminist. And I feel like my project is trying to come from there rather than come from another place and then pull feminism and queer in. Does that make sense? But I do absolutely get this rendering of anarchism as a sort of heroic masculinist Fight Club version, the rebel, the Sex Pistols probably. You know, the rebel guy who, but for some twist of fate, would have been a banker but is now a punk. And is in the end doing the same work, discursively and symbolically. So that's the task really here. The task is to make for a new form of anarchy. Anarchy is the word that we have for anti-state politics. And a new form of feminism. Feminism is the word that we have for an invested politics around gender and divisions of labor and intimacy. New forms, because we can't afford to just throw away entire traditions where work has already gone on that could be of use to us. So, you know, when I was doing Gaga feminism, people are like, but why are you even holding on to feminism? I mean, as if like we don't need feminism anymore? Like, what world are people living in that would be true? So I guess I'm trying to take some of these terms that we have some partial understanding of and push them into a different era, a different discursive space with new renderings of the political, the social, the collective, the commons, etc. I don't know if it's possible, but I hope that it's a break from those kinds of ego-ideal formations that you're talking about.
I mean, I was thinking very similarly, because just in the last few months, this kind of rise that I was talking about, I mean, people that have been thought as allies, like Mark Fisher, anyone who's engaged in this will know, have come out as being kind of really anti-queer, anti-feminist.
You're surprised?
No, not at all. But you know, this happens just anecdotally, and a few people know about this as well. Like the last anarchist book fair in London, I was there. It was terrifying. I ended up having a kind of triggering panic attack, so did many of my friends. It was a completely unsafe space for queer people, particularly for trans people. And the organisers and so many of these boys were like, oh, well, you wanted an anarchist fair. We can't have a safe spaces policy because anarchism doesn't make for policy. So we can't do this. And I guess the potential that I was hearing in your talk was this idea of the fugitive space.
Right.
So it's like, okay, well, you're not safe there. So then where do you kind of go?
Okay.
And I guess maybe I was thinking about how also pragmatically that can be produced in those kinds of instances where like anarchy actually, or the community of anarchists really fails, or kind of fails others.
Okay, a couple of things. Thank you. Okay. First, in another version, or let's say another chapter of this book where I do talk about No Church in the Wild, I have a whole critique of Mark Fisher. That's not mysterious to me at all. did anyone think that capitalist realism was not actually about reconsolidation of a kind of masculinist rendering of everything that's wrong will be, you know, corrected by apparently white guys who know something that none of us know? It's a Zizhakian thing. It's like, what is capitalist realism? You think you're opposing capitalism, wrong, you are feeding back into capitalism, right? And he gives the example of Wall-E, which really got me mad. Okay? You know, for me, animated films actually do deliver you to a kind of loopy universe where all kinds of weird things happen. For him, the fact that an animated film would perform anti-capitalism means that it is performing it for you, so you don't have to. What? Okay? So that doesn't, I don't even care about this capitalist realism thing. I think Naomi Klein has said it better many times. Forget it. But I'm not going to go with you to the safe space either. I don't want a safe space. I'm hearing this language around triggering a lot recently, and wondering why everyone is endlessly being traumatized and whether that psychologicalization of the political is so useful to us right now. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, look, we're in a space where people feel entitled to be racist, homophobic, transphobic, right?
Yeah. I mean, but it's also, if it's done right, it's a politicization of trauma, though. I mean, I think if it's done right, it's not that. It's an idea. So, for example, when people talk about self-care as if that self is outside of political, I find that really problematic, and that does happen a lot. I'm talking about. But I think that when you consider these things, the medicalization of trauma is that's very complicated and very, very problematic, and the kind of overuse of these sorts of terms. But I think that for me, the politicization of trauma and of that voice as itself also one that escapes the state, because it does, because the kind of traumatized subject that can still speak is already fugitive for me. So I guess maybe there's a sense where, I don't know, there must be some kind of negotiation, or not no negotiation, but that these spaces, or some kind of spaces, I don't know, I guess it's slightly more complicated, I think, than dismissing it because you don't want to be saved, which I also understand as well.
Yeah, not.
I don't know, maybe.
I almost feel like this is a generational shift, the safe space thing. Let's just negotiate in those spaces without demanding that they be safe. There's a great book just came out by Christina Hanhart that has safe space in the title, that is arguing that gay and lesbian communities literally begin to work with neoliberalism rather than against them, to the extent that they keep asking for safe space. And again, they ask for the protection of the state against who? Usually it's bourgeois white gays and lesbians asking for protection from the state against lawless communities of color who are supposedly always coming to bash them, as if there are no, queer people of color, as if there isn't a kind of force of poverty, there isn't class doing work here. There's just this very, very vulnerable gay and lesbian group that has to be protected. So Christina Hanhart's book gives us this history of how did anti-violence politics trump all other kinds of politics in gay and lesbian organizing and take the place of coalitional politics, where gays and lesbians in the 1970s were basically communists looking for solidarities with anti-racist and anti-poverty groups. By the 1980s, she shows through meticulous oral history, gay and lesbian groups had become very narrow, single-issue, focus on safe space anti-violence campaigns, even where there wasn't a lot of evidence of violence in the first place. Okay? So that's super controversial, but I'll tell you what, the archive bears her argument out. And so I'm worried, to be frank, I'm worried about this new discourse about safe space and the use of the language of trauma to potentially close down conversations that might be difficult and awkward, but probably should happen. Not necessarily with Mark Fisher.
I mean, I guess that's the point, is on whose terms. So what kind of spaces, of fugitive spaces, yeah, I guess, on whose terms are those conversations?
Well, let's not materialize a fugitive space. Let's try to hold on to fugitivity as an epistemology, rather than like, are we in a fugitive space? No, we're not. We're not. Let's instead think about spaces that are going to be productive of other kinds of social connection, rather than fortifying boundaries between groups that already think of themselves as mutually exclusive. For me, that would be the goal. And I think that, again, anarchy, or this term, the wild, to the extent that it does not reduce down to one group, has that potential. It has other kinds of weird potentials too. But I thank you for that point, because I really want to actually think through that. Maybe you can give me some readings or advice. So let's talk afterwards. Yes?
I was thinking throughout your talk about Jose Munoz, actually, and I suppose maybe my question feeds in a little bit to what Sarah was saying, because I feel like I'm not quite convinced, maybe, yet by anarchy or anarchism, because I wonder, because of some of the similar reservations I think that we've just been talking about, but also because I wonder what anarchism or anarchy can give us that Cruising Utopia didn't already, I suppose, if that's not a controversial thing to say. Or I'm wondering, I'd like to hear more about exactly what you think it is that allows.
Look, no critical thinking is in the place of some other critical thinking. It's with. That's the point. And, weirdly, Jose and Talia Nyong'o and I had just begun a book called 3 Paths to the Wild, because separate from each other, we each were writing things that had the same archive. Like Jose was writing about the undercommons and wildness and punk, LA punk actually, and I wrote the intro for the undercommons and was thinking about punk in relationship to feminist punk, and was writing about wildness. Tavia was writing about fugitivity, wildness, and something else. So we were already all thinking in the same archive, and I think our point was to not divide up the territory and say, well, you take this piece, you take this piece, but in fact to break with the author text, and go for something collaborative, which would be very much in keeping with this idea that everything can't boil down to a heroic voice leading the way, right? So I see myself as very much benefiting from the legacy created by Cruising Utopia, which I read in manuscript form and dialogued with and so on. And I see it as opening the door to all of these other utopian projects. And that was the amazing thing about Jose, was that he was willing to be a utopian in a world of naysayers. And in a Foucauldian universe, it is hard to be a utopian, and I bet that's where that labyrinthine Foucauldian question was going to go. But so, how can one think without it? But it's not an instead of. Can it say anything that Cruising Utopia doesn't? Probably not. But let's say it again, as well.
It's devastating that collaborative book won't happen.
It will happen, because there's lots of stuff out there. It will happen, yeah.
It's reassuring.
Yeah.
Do you feel that this word of the wild actually might kind of come from a dialectic pace, kind of having this order, which maybe comes from this Christian idea of like the devil always being wild and God being order? And I feel like that's peculiar. Obviously, you talked about this in like to think into the hell. Was like the first anarchist moment when like Eve eats the tree of knowledge, and like this idea of wildness being tied to this like notion of the devil being like the first true anarchist and rebel. And then also that kind of interesting in terms of how I believe that New York, Manhattan, is a grid which is order, which is like this Christian religious thing that was like created in a way to be like orderly, and then Occupy kind of embedded in that like physical and like conceptual environment of that, and just like if you think that, because for me that's where I'm assuming this idea of wildness and anarchy really comes down to this like Christian.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting question. I have a lot of stuff in here about religion, about a kind of an anti-religion, and I have a piece in the No Church in the Wild chapter that's about the faith of the faithless, which is the title of a book by Simon Critchley, in which he borrows from Oscar Wilde, who while Wilde was in prison, writing De Profundis, in prison, being jailed for obscenity, he realizes that he has a kind of awakening. Now, usually when people are in prison, they have an awakening, it's of a religious order, but Wilde's awakening was that the only confraternity you can find in a prison is the confraternity of the faithless. And I kind of take that and run with it to say that faithlessness also requires a dedication and a discipline. It's not only belief that requires discipline. In a very religious world, it actually takes a lot of discipline to maintain one's faithlessness. And wild would be, and there's the happy coincidence of the name wild, is really why Oscar Wilde is an anarchist thinker in that sense. So I want to hold it separate from that religious context where everything is just a dialectic between good and evil, God and the devil, a Hegelian master-slave, because the wild actually is not about dialectics. I would want to argue against that and say that the wild is about a different order that doesn't run through the binaries, hence the kind of queer and feminist orientation, and that has an element of the random.
I mean, I meant more kind of just maybe is that why we're using the word wild?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm using the word wild because it's like it keeps coming up. It came up in this Jay-Z, Kanye collaboration, No Church in the Wild, which is kind of a wonderful phrase that has lots of different resonances, that is a critique of institutionality, not a critique of spirituality. And then Wu Sang's film, Wildness, people are reaching for another vocabulary. We need some other way of narrating the world that we're in, and we have vocabularies. They are available to us, and they can't be cleansed of all of the nasty projections that have given them a particular inscription and meaning, but they can be reused. This is a recycling of the category of the wild as it comes out of its colonial context and enters into a new phase. So just the same with queer. Queer didn't mean the queer politics that we have created it in a contemporary sense. It meant something really different. So this notion of re-signifying seems really, really important. Now, it might be at a certain moment we're going to get rid of even the term anarchy, just as at a certain moment we may get rid of the term feminism, because we may feel that it calls too much attention to the binary of man-woman, or the category of anarchy makes some sort of weird binary between the state and the non-state, and there are all kinds of other things in between. But you have to, in order for us to think, we have to use words that already have meaning. We can't just pull neologisms out of nowhere. Then you end up with this kind of Deleuzean universe where one person has produced the vocabulary and everyone else is using it. I don't want that either. So I'm trying to use a word that has a lot of different meanings, but doesn't boil down to something. And there's a great line that I use at the end of the talk, the chapter on Rite of Spring, where Isadora Duncan says, actually in relationship to Rite of Spring, she said something like, remember, don't let them tame you. Remember, you were wild once, or remember, we were wild once. And I like that conjuring of a wildness that we were and a wildness that we could be. Neither of which are particularly clear as to what the reference is, but give of possibility. And I think that's exactly what the Wallace Stevens poem is about, that there's something that exceeds the jaw and the wilderness it produces. There's something else, and that something requires a language in order for us to even approach it. Probably we're... Yes.
Well, thank you, Professor Greg.